Good evening. Welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out tonight for what promises to be an amazing conversation. One bit of housekeeping. Unfortunately, Madeline Baran will not be able to join us. That's why 3 chairs are there instead of 4, as an emergency came up. So we're sorry about that, but we think we'll have very vital conversations. My name is Sarah Oger. I'm the Executive Director of Humanities New York. We are the 501c3 partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Shout out for that great cultural agency as part of our federal government, has just weathered a shutdown. The mission of Humanities New York is to strengthen civil society and the bonds of community using the humanities to foster engaged inquiry and dialogue around social and cultural concerns. We encourage such inquiry and dialogue not only through events such as tonight's, but through our grant making and through programs such as community conversations and reading and discussion. All of our offerings strive to help New Yorkers form and articulate their ideas and beliefs, develop critical thinking, analysis, synthesis, and problem-solving skills, and to help us talk about and understand the ideas that define us as individuals and connect us to our communities. Through our work, we strive to show how the humanities remain vital to both our personal development and civic discourse, which brings me to tonight. Tonight's event is part of a series called Democracy and the Informed Citizen, an initiative administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils. This initiative seeks to deepen the public's knowledge and appreciation of the vital connections between democracy, the humanities, journalism, and an informed citizenry. We thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their generous support of this initiative and the Pulitzer Prizes for their partnership. I'd also like to thank for their financial support the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for this event. Throughout our contribution, which is a national one, to democracy and the informed citizen, Humanities New York has hosted such journalists as Matt Apuzzo, Isabel Wilkerson, Bill Adair, Michael Moss, Michael Weinerip, Amanda Petrusic, Manoush Zamarati, Cliff Levy, and many others on such topics as the NYPD's surveillance of New York's Muslim communities, the necessity and difficulty of fact-checking in today's world, and how to properly communicate and report on climate science, and the American prison ecosystem. If you would like to receive early information and access to upcoming events, please consider joining Humanities New York as a member. Information is available at the check-in table, or you can speak to one of our members of the Humanities New York staff or board in the room. We're wearing these little, little green pins. And we're joined by the chair of our board, Sarah Gelman-Carney. So if you want to know anything about grants, go ask her. Just kidding. You can ask me too. The way that we, and I also want to point out Michael Washburn, standing there by the curator of our event, and also somebody you can speak to not only for more information about what we do, but if you have great ideas for how to keep doing journalism projects and new subjects. He's taking ideas today. So I mentioned the programs we run at Humanities New York, and one very important thing about how we practice the public humanities is that it doesn't have to be top-down. We aren't here to have our panelists educate you. Rather, our events are about dialogue, and in order to draw on the expertise in this room and on the stage, we'll structure our event a little bit differently than a standard panel discussion. So the presentation part will be broken down into 3 sections, and each of those is followed by an audience Q&A, so not just at the end. The first section will have the panelists discuss what feels like the current writing boom in true crime. Second, we will discuss the mechanics behind the work of what the panelists do every day. And finally, we'll look at the impact on individuals and society that this kind of journalism has. And after each of those sections, we'll have a Q&A of about 10 minutes. Now, to make that all fit, we want to hear from different people, and so your question has to be micro question, like 30 seconds. Sometimes it helps not to include comment, just a question. I know that's brief, I know that's hard, but let's try. We'll have a microphone. It's to make it really, really short. The microphone so you can use it, and just make sure to wait until you have the mic in your hand and then give it right back after a question. And we'd like to start with something for you in the audience. I'm going to ask you a question, and you don't have to tell us what you guys said, but turn to the audience member next to you that you didn't come with and discuss what about the topic of tonight's conversation is so important to you? Why did you come? And why do you think it's important? So what was important about tonight's conversation and why? And talk to somebody, and you get 2 minutes. I'll interrupt you, don't worry. Go. Okay. Wow. This sounds amazing, and I hate to do this, but I have to stop you now. Informed networking and community building, we just love to hear it, and I would let you do it all night, but we do have a panel. Tonight's conversation, I get to introduce our moderator, and she'll introduce the panelists in turn. So Jia Tolentino will moderate, and welcome back, Jia, to moderating an event for us. She is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where, among other writings, she has done pieces on the ongoing cultural reckoning with sexual abuse and the Me Too moment. Before joining The New Yorker, she was the deputy editor at Jezebel and a contributing editor at The Hairpin. And Jia will then introduce the other guests. So please join me in welcoming our panel. Thank you.
Hi, you guys. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to you guys. I'm so excited to be talking to Pam and Josie about a subject that I know very little about, except from things that I have read and heard in their work. Pamela Koloff is a senior reporter at ProPublica and a writer at large at the New York Times Magazine. She's been nominated for 6 national magazine awards, more than any other female writer in the awards history, and 1 for feature writing in 2013. That was for The Innocent Man, right? We'll talk about that. Josie Duffy Rice is a lawyer, journalist, and a 2019 Nation Institute Fellow. As senior reporter for The Appeal, she covers prosecutors, prisons, and other criminal justice issues, and hosts the podcast Justice in America, which is great. I highly recommend that. I've been personally recommending it to all of my friends because I was brushing up for this panel, and I've just ended up talking about it to everybody I know, and that's how you know something's like really great. So thanks, you guys, for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So this is a huge topic, and we're not going to solve anything in an hour and a half, but I want to start with a question that might be frustratingly broad, but I think will set the stage for this discussion in terms of, so what is the role of journalists and journalism with regard to wrongful convictions and the criminal justice system generally versus what should it be? Like, this is something, Madeline's not here, tragically, but I was just thinking today about one of the most chilling parts in The Dark for me was where she goes through, one of her reporters spends like 9 months combing through records to find out that the DA had struck black jurors at like 4.5 times the rate of white jurors. And for me, it was like, oh yeah, this is something that maybe a lot of people would assume that a regulatory body or some sort of general oversight body would do, and it's not. And Josie, I remember listening to your podcast recently, and you were saying, you just mentioned in passing some death row cases somewhere in the Southeast that hadn't even barely made the news. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, yeah, what is the role as it stands, and what, in your minds, ought to be the role?
I'll say a little bit and then throw this over to Josie. I think, when we look at abuses of power, I can't think of a greater one than a wrongful conviction, especially when you really dig down into many of these cases and see that some of the people who helped make that conviction happen should have known better. So I think broadly, one of the roles of journalism is to shine a light on those abuses, and this particular kind of case, I think, is very captivating to us as both writers and readers for that reason. I think, and I know we'll get into this a little bit more later, but one of the things I struggle with is there's so many things that we need to shine a light on. So how do we pick what we're writing about? How do we choose how to use that precious time? And how do we make issues that aren't always interesting, like jury selection, deeply compelling, which I'm going to be speaking about Madeline a lot tonight, even though she's not here, which Madeline did in The Dark, and which I think we try to do with our work too.
Yeah, I think that there are some incredible stories about wrongful convictions that exist out there. They really only scratch the surface, but you can find, I mean, I think especially today, these just an array of stories that are kind of trying to shine a light on how many people in the system are innocent and go to spend decades in prison, sometimes die in prison for something that they didn't do. I worry sometimes that journalism and that media makes these situations seem unique when they are not, and even further than them not being unique, wrongful convictions not being unique, the patterns that we see play out in these cases play out constantly in much smaller cases among people who maybe are guilty of what they've been accused of, prosecutorial misconduct, police brutality, a racist system that kind of replicates racist structures. So the only thing that I worry about when I see these stories is making sure that it's clear that this is not an aberration, but business as usual in a system that there is no oversight. It's completely opaque. We don't even know what we don't know. So as journalists, I think it's our responsibility to tell the stories of what we can't see as well as what we can.
Right. It's interesting, like in thinking about the criminal justice system as this opaque, enormous river that breaks to the surface, most readily in cases like this. And this is something that I think about with journalism in general all the time, where there are, with certain things, I even think about it with sexual assault cases, we're in a lot of things that are really important, there's a tension between what is representative and what's extraordinary, right? Mm-hmm. And as journalists, we have, there's a narrative need for the extraordinary. There's as humans, our attention goes to the extraordinary, but the tension is always, how do we show that these cases may be extraordinary in some ways, but what went wrong is entirely representative? Mm-hmm. And so, Josie, you started talking about, so we're here to talk about wrongful convictions, but what do you guys, how many definitions of that term are there, right? How many convictions are there that are wrongful, but even if the person, as you said, may be guilty, right? Mm-hmm. How do you guys think about that?
So this is what I talk about ad nauseum. But I think that I love how much attention the criminal justice system is getting now and compared to what it was getting 10, 20 years ago. It's remarkable. And it actually is having an impact.
How do you locate that upswell? Is there's the new Jim Crow, they're just things that all started happening. Yeah, I think the new Jim Crow is a major point. Yeah. It's hard to know what was the point in my life and the point in everybody else's life, sure. But about 10 years ago, I went to work for the public defender, and I had worked for the prosecutor's office in San Francisco for a second before, and I had not liked it. But I went to work for the public defender, and I remember going to the courthouse and seeing the line of people outside at 7 a.m. and thinking, how did I not know this was happening? This was happening right up the street from where I had lived for years. I had no idea that this system was kind of processing people in the way that it was. I think that these stories get told more now. The fact that we even say the word prosecutor as a political actor now is just totally unprecedented than it was 5 years ago, I even think. But I still think that we pay a lot of attention to wrongful convictions in private prisons in a way that is not representative of what the system is actually dealing with. Most people who come through the criminal justice system have probably been might be guilty. Most people convicted of murder might be guilty of murder, and yet the system still kind of perpetuates injustices against the guilty and the innocent that they have been ensured protection from our Constitution. And we tend to think that only the people who are nonviolent drug offenders or only the people who are innocent are worth, getting rights, having rights. And that is actually just not true and not what we would want for any of us. And so, I think about that a lot in terms of what's a wrongful conviction, because I have seen a ton of cases. I was just talking to Jia about a case about a 17-year-old who was convicted of murder for punching an elderly guy who then broke his shoulder bone, and then after he broke his shoulder bone, he had to go to surgery, and after surgery, he had a blood clot, and he died of the blood clot. He was convicted of murder. That's not a wrongful conviction. That's technically, under the law, a right conviction, but he was 17. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. To me, that's a wrongful
conviction. He's not innocent of what he's been convicted of, but I think our definition of wrongful conviction is really narrow, and that we should think about what the state owes us instead of what we, not just what a person has done wrong.
Along those lines, in Texas, we have something called the law of parties. And yeah, I really, really need to write about it. But the law of parties says that, let's say a group, it's usually a group of young people, drive somewhere, two of the guys in the car go inside, usually to rip someone off of their weed. It goes awry, someone gets killed. The guy behind the wheel, whether he knew or didn't know what was going to happen on that trip, is as guilty in the eyes of Texas law as the shooter. And there are actually people on Texas death row who are who've been convicted under the law of parties, not that exact scenario. So there are all these different, how do we judge guilt or innocence? What if the driver knew that his friends had guns when they went in the house? I mean, there's so many interesting questions that we can ask in assessing guilt or innocence, but there's so many narratives that we need to explore, and I agree that I think sometimes writers, editors, readers, we want that sort of perfect hero, and one of the frustrations, this may be a strange way to say it, but the stories of mine that have gotten the most traction are the stories in which the person was at no fault and was blameless of everything. And I've written many other stories that had a lot of grays in them that just sort of didn't catch.
I wanted to ask you about that because you had mentioned that earlier. And so it's like there's one way to think about stories that hinge on innocence, right? Kind of absolute innocence as, they're opening the door. Because I do think that these stories have played, there are many things that have played a role in this whole dialogue opening up over the last years. I do think that wrongful conviction stories, because of the bright lines that they show, I think that there's a way in which they open the door for all of these things, but there's also a way in which they might, like human attention is unfortunately finite, and there are some ways in which they could also shut the doors to stories, or kind of they sort of preclude the understanding of how much gray is in the vast majority of these cases, right? And how has that affected how you think about what stories you're writing, and even looking back at those stories, how has your understanding of what drew people to them shifted or changed in the last, because you've been reporting on this for a long time, yeah.
I'm really interested in the idea of forgiveness and redemption, and that's something that I've tried to write about a number of times. And those stories have not captivated people the way they've captivated me. But to me, it's a really interesting question when we look at, for example, incarceration, or we look at life without the possibility of parole. What is the purpose of that incarceration? Is it purely punitive? Is it to give the victim or the victim's family some sense of justice? Is it, you could list so many different things, but what is it? I don't think we really know. I don't think anyone ever really articulates what that is. And I'm fascinated with, many people have dramatic transformations during their time in prison. Does that count? Is that something that we should consider? Is it real? How do we evaluate it? Does it matter what the victim or victim's family thinks of that transformation? There are just so many interesting questions there. And I think the finality of some of these sentences is what's so striking to me, that in life, things are more flexible or grayer. When you get a death sentence or life without the possibility of parole, or effectively a life sentence given your age, that's usually it. And so that's something I need to figure out how to explore in a more captivating way, I guess.
Let me ask you guys, so I should have asked this first maybe, but how did you guys, just as a grounding question, how did you guys get into this work, and do you remember anything in particular, a news story, anything that tipped you into deciding to work on criminal justice issues?
Well, I worked at the public defender's office, as I mentioned, and then I was like, I should go to law school, which was a mistake. I should not have gone to law school.
Even though me and Pam were like, should we go to law school?
And I'm like, don't go to law school. Anybody in here
But
thinking
should
about
I?
it, don't do it. And I went to law school, and I took out a lot of loans, and then I graduated from law school and was like, I don't like this at all. So
But had you considered going to law school before working in the defender's office, or was it that experience?
I think I had considered it in like an I don't know what I want to do, I'll just go to law school sort of way. I had not understood kind of the dynamics of what the system did and what it perpetuated and what it created in communities. Like when I worked at the public defender's office, I was an assistant, and then I would go to an after-school program and help the kids, and a lot of them were years behind where they should have been, and their parents were our clients, and you saw the cycle just playing out like real time. And then, you know, I got to leave, and a lot of people don't get to leave that experience. And so I always like to write, so I took a job. I mean, it was not a very scientific process of how I got here. But I will say that like the stories that you know, the reason that I think writing about this really matters are the stories that highlight how many different places, you know, it's like a choose your own adventure of how many places the system can go wrong without ever being held accountable at all. One of the first stories I wrote about was about a guy who had sent a naked picture to himself when he was 17, and he was charged as an adult for having like nude pictures of a minor, which was him. So they and just to me, that was just like, I was like, why isn't this on the front page of the New York Times? This is insane. Right. But it happens constantly, and there's no retribution for this. I mean, when we talk about forgiveness and retribution, like, it's not just that we're so retributive to people in the system, it's that we have no retribution to the people, like, people going through the system. We have no retribution for the people in power. And so, to me, that has been, what has been important is to try to point out to people, here are the you know, you elect your sheriff, right? You elect your DA, and you have the potential to elect someone who, you know, when you know that they've done something like this, you cannot elect them next time, right? Or you can like ask them about it.
And that is starting to bubble up. It's amazing in the midterms.
It's really exciting. Yeah, we'll see what happens. Yeah. Manhattan, elect a new DA next time.
Ask your lawyer friends. That's what I do. Because they know.
Or not, whatever.
Or not.
But but it's just to say that like there is potential for this being a democratic, accountable system, but we're not exercising it. And so to me, that's what made me really want to get into this, is like seeing it from the public defender's office and feeling like I had no idea this is happening.
I'm the daughter of 2 lawyers, so I knew I didn't want to go to law school, but I did always want to be to write for magazines. But the 2 pieces, without getting into my long story of how I got to where I am now, but I think the 2 things that were the most influential to me are actually both innocent stories. One is Errol Morris's documentary, The Thin Blue Line, which was earth-shattering when I first saw it in high school, and I watched it again a couple weeks ago. I watch it every few years and see new things, and that was just such a powerful story of a wrongful conviction of a man named Randall Dale Adams, who was sent to death row wrongfully for he was accused of killing a Dallas cop. And I think the film is so compelling in so many ways, but one of the things it showed me was that you could tell this really powerful accountability story in an artistic and beautiful way with a Philip Glass score. And that was just so mind-boggling, and that really, you know, in some way I wanted to do what that was, whatever that was. And I think the other piece that really just changed everything for me is a David Grann piece called Trial by Fire, which I'm constantly tweeting and talking about and have written about for CJR. It was a New Yorker piece in 2009, and it's just a magnificent piece about a wrongful conviction in which a man in Texas was actually executed for the deaths of his children. This was a terrible house fire, and we know now that it was likely an accidental cause for that fire. And the way that Grann tells the story is just so gripping and so compelling. And when you get to the end, which is the execution, it's I think, the most devastating thing I've ever read. I know that's a strong statement, but I really felt that way. So both of those pieces really left a mark on me.
That piece is wild. Yeah. All right, so we've got time for some questions, ideally on the subject of the current true crime boom or appetite for it or the formation of these stories, if anyone has them. What, 3 questions? Oh yeah, and also there are going to be three of these, so. Oh yeah, over there.
I was wondering, you mentioned that you can politically elect sheriffs and DAs. If you don't have lawyer friends or if you're moving around to different states, are there any resources you recommend that people can go to see kind of the platforms of these people? Because I've tried to Google them before during these elections, and I'm just like, I don't even know what I'm looking
So, number
at.
one, congratulations on not having lawyer friends. You're doing it right. You're on the right path. But so the answer is sometimes. It depends on where you move. A couple years ago, I was trying to look up every DA in the country as part of my new job. And there are some, you literally can't find their names online, actually. There's like almost nothing. I mean, you'd have to FOIA the person's name. There are 2,300 in the nation. It sort of depends on where you are. What I can say is that there are some organizations like Color of Change, the Justice Collaborative, which is the umbrella in which I work, the Open Philanthropy. There are some organizations that are actually really trying to kind of crowdsource and learn this information. What I can also say is, like, no matter where you are, if you're in Manhattan or you're in LA versus like the smallest town, the gap is actually not as big as you would think, right? Because the reality is that you don't know what even the DA of Manhattan or the DA of Brooklyn is doing every day. You know maybe the biggest stories, or you can get them on the record about their platform. But we're talking about people, I mean, in Chicago, they process almost 500,000 cases a year. So like the idea that you could even get a modicum of an idea of what they're doing day after day is actually an illusion. So you want to, I mean, there are some places that can give you some information, but I do think it's important to recognize that you're not going to get the full spectrum of what they're doing at this point, given what we have. So I don't know if that's an encouraging answer, but again, don't have any lawyer friends.
Right, this also comes at the, like, we're talking about this at the same time that, like, local journalism has just fully collapsed,
Right,
which is
right,
the scariest thing
right,
about
exactly.
these specific elections.
Yeah, totally.
I can't add much to that, but the fact that you're even asking that question makes me so happy.
Yeah, seriously.
Another question. That was a great one. Oh, you're right there.
My question had to do with the ethics, like with all these podcasts, when you're going to exonerate somebody, oftentimes people are pointing maybe a finger in a different direction. I'm wondering if you could discuss a little bit about the ethics of putting people in the spotlight who might not otherwise have been in the spotlight as a potential alternate suspect to a crime or something like that.
That's a tough one because it's so different from case to case. I know that in the first season of Serial, I remember being a bit uncomfortable as the story rolled out week in, week out, with how Jay is introduced, for those of you who are familiar, and the questions that were posed about him, and that had real life consequences for him. So I think that's a really important question. I think that to counter that, so many of those questions are not asked before a case goes to trial. Or before a plea deal is accepted or whatever. You see again and again and again, so many of these cases begin with tunnel vision on the part of law enforcement, and they become certain of one person and a set of facts. And there are multiple different things that should be explored that aren't. And I think our role as journalists is to try to do some of that work that wasn't necessarily done, and to do it in as responsible a way as possible. And sometimes that's difficult.
I remember, Pam, when the Times op-ed board did the piece about blood spatter analysis after you did the Joe Bryan piece, I remember the fact in there that, like, the FBI had just done a review of 2 decades of forensic analysis, and their hair sample, the FBI's hair sample people had ruled incorrectly in favor of the prosecution 95% of the time or something like that. And this is, again, this is something I'm really interested in, and I still was like, what? How could this be true? And I didn't know this, and this wasn't written on my brain, it's mind-blowing.
Well, I think one of the things that's been so frustrating, and I'm sure you feel the same way, is so many of us and so many of your friends have been raised on like CSI and Dexter and all these shows where the assumption is, it's science, like science doesn't lie, and science tells us the truth. And a whole generation of Americans have been raised with that belief. And
Spoiler alert.
Exactly, spoiler alert, not true.
So you're certified as a bloodstain pattern expert, right?
Like pattern analyst.
And it took you like 2 days and like a certificate, right?
Yeah. It took me a week. So for the last story I wrote for the Times Magazine and ProPublica, this was a murder case that hinged on some analysis of the blood spatter at the crime scene. And so I discovered that the expert in this case had become an expert by taking a week-long class in bloodstain pattern analysis, and I discovered that many of these experts have only taken 40 or in some cases 60 or 80 hours. So I went and took the class myself, and I now have a little certificate, and my services are available for anyone who needs them. This is how I'm going to put my kids through college. And but that was really horrifying, and while working on that, to learn that we've had so far, I don't know the exact number, but I think we're currently at 330 some odd DNA exonerations in the US currently, and half of those, a contributing factor to those convictions was faulty forensic analysis or testimony. So on the one hand, we have this narrative on TV, and then in reality, we have something very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's also, maybe this can just lead us into the next section. I think I remembered, something that I think about and something that I didn't understand until I was an editor at a website and became aware of the, kind of brutally minute by minute aware of the vagaries of breaking news, was that when people are talking about something is the least good time to talk about it. And we hear about this a lot with gun violence, like shooting stories, but especially when we get there's already such a narrative, there's already such a deference towards the prosecution as being, the correct narrative always by default without question. And especially when news is breaking of some story, it's usually the only story we have. Mm-hmm. And so here we're going to talk about the mechanics of how y'all choose and work on these stories. And I'm wondering, this was something, how much easier is it to do these cases in retrospect? Is it possible to cover these things in real time in a way that will allow you to extract the necessary information from the state? And how does that affect how you guys think about what stories to pick? And yeah.
Well, Pam was on my podcast last week talking about this very thing. So she has very smart things to say that you can hear here or on my podcast. But it is interesting because part of the benefit of doing this work nationally is that I don't have to keep relationships or make friends in a way that is very different if you're locally reporting on a shooting that happened just a few seconds ago. So the question, if you're a local reporter, is do I fight the prosecution on what totally may have happened, right? Do I fight the police source? Do I make enemies with someone that tomorrow I'm going to need as a reference or as a source? And there isn't always someone there to kind of provide an alternate explanation. There isn't always a defense attorney, or there isn't, the timing of this stuff, like you said, just does not lead itself to giving a fair shot to the other side. I think the other thing is that Wesley said this on the podcast last week, but I really liked what he said, which is that we kind of naturally believe the powerful people. And so when we hear a defendant say, actually, that's not what happened, we're actually probably more likely to believe the cop. And I find myself maybe top 1% skeptical of all law enforcement sources doing the same thing. I mean, this is what I love about Pam's work. When she was like, forensic science isn't real, I was like, I hadn't even ever thought of that. Like, I had just been like, yeah, blood splatters. That sounds totally legit. Right. And it turns
or, you know, I mean, what's it, Michael, what's his name in The Innocent Man?
Michael Morton.
Right, Michael Morton. In that case, it was like, oh, there's this, you know, blood-spattered handkerchief that has just not been analyzed for 20 years.
Right.
And I was like, that's surely not possible, you know?
Right.
But it is very normal, and yeah.
And it's normal, especially when people are processing people day in and day after. You know, you get immune to the way that what this system incentivizes you to do. And it actually, you can sleep fine at night, like not processing someone's handkerchief, or not, like, you know, turning over evidence to the other side, or not providing a fair trial, if you convince yourself, like you were saying, that they're guilty, which is really easy to do if you're doing this. I mean, you get really jaded. And so I think that is kind of the number one thing that's complicated, is not only are we dealing with like problematic incentives on the journalist side, but it's also like, usually when law enforcement's telling you something, I think they actually do believe it most of the time, even if it is wrong.
No, I think that's true. And what I said on Josie's amazing podcast, it's so good.
I paid them to say this.
Was I compared a trial to an iceberg, in the sense that about 10% of the information is presented. There's so much context that's missing. Who are these people? What are their histories? What are their histories together? What happened that whole day that the incident happened? On and on and on and on. And I love reporting things after the fact, especially well after the fact, when things have cooled down and people can talk about things in a more dispassionate way. And it's so interesting to revisit some of these cases years later and sit in people's living rooms and ask them some of these questions. And in the Joe Bryan case that I was just talking about, the blood spatter case, Joe Bryan was this beloved high school principal in this community in Texas. He was married to a school teacher who was murdered, and he was 120 miles away, but nevertheless remains in prison for her murder. And when I would go and visit people, I would say, you know, I understand that he was this beloved figure, but now everyone's sort of turned against him. Can you tell me what changed? Like, what happened between you trusting him with your children to now? And people would say, well, he was convicted. And I would say, okay, but what was the evidence, or what was the key piece? And they would say, well, you know, the jurors heard the evidence and they decided he was guilty, so, you know, he must be guilty. And so I think unpacking that with people, like, is that all you have? Like, that's, and do you know about these things that I found out, and this and this and this that wasn't presented to the jury? That can be a really interesting reporting process, and something really interesting to write about too.
Yeah, I was thinking about this to bring up in the dark. There's a part of it where she's interviewing former jurors of Curtis Flowers' 6 trials, and you know, most of them are white. The vast majority of them are white by the DA's, you know, very careful hand there, and the tone of their voice when they're describing how satisfied they were with the trial, they're just like, the barely subtext is like, well, there was a trial, you know. They're like, I thought the trial was great, you know, like it's. That a process has been put in place, and it's just that the process exists that is so comforting, versus the opposite. Josie, I wonder if you could talk about things that you, in terms of mechanics, in terms of things that you see either overemphasized or underemphasized in stories about criminal justice, not just wrongful convictions. In general, you talk about this a lot on your podcast.
Yeah, I think that the language we use to talk about the system in general concerns me. We talk about people as convicts, we talk about them as criminals, we talk about them as kind of static figures of their worst moment versus complicated, like all of us are complicated. Like Pam said, we leave a lot of the story untold. We don't talk about trauma, and we don't talk about who people really are, which is, in a single situation, you might be the victim or the offender. Usually it's more complicated than that in terms of who you are as a whole. Most offenders have been victimized. Most people who commit crimes have had crimes committed against them. That's just statistics. But I also I try to highlight the middle. We tell a lot of stories about police, and probably not enough. And we tell a lot of stories about prisons, and again, probably not enough. Very rarely does the middle get any attention, where the prosecution comes in and where they leave. And you know, we have a system where over 95% of cases are pled out, which means we have no idea what was told to the defense, to their attorney, what the conversation was, what they plead this person out versus that person. So much of this just goes untold. What's interesting to me is to try to let people know what they don't know. Yeah. Just to repeat something I say a lot, which is just this idea, like to your point about the trial, people really think that they have seen the whole picture, and you just haven't, and that's the design. So to ensure that when people are reading a story or going through this process, they can think, what am I missing? What am I missing, or what are they not telling me? I think is critical to kind of trying to tell these stories.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, we've talked a lot about what narratives prosecutors don't tell, or what jurors don't hear. And I think something else for us to think about when we look at the true crime boom, a lot of programming on Netflix and so forth, is different ways that we should and could be telling these stories that we're not. I detest the name My Favorite Murder. That podcast just makes me so angry. I know many people like that podcast. I think it's easy for people to forget, and I think that this name embodies that this is about real people. There was a real victim in that crime. There was a real perpetrator. There were people hurt on both sides. And so I think you can see in a lot of the recent narratives that we've looked at, the Ted Bundy series is the one that set me off most recently. It's so important to think of different ways to tell that story. What if the Ted Bundy story, instead of like all these shots of him looking all cool and whatever, and him talking and actually not saying anything very interesting, and the focus being Ted, Ted, Ted. What if the story had been told from the perspective of the victims' families and his surviving victims? What if he hadn't been given a voice and we'd heard a totally different account of what happened? And so that's just something I think about a lot, is how are we not telling stories in ways that we should be?
Yeah, I mean, I frankly hate most true crime, because most of it, I think, is presented in that way. Maybe I shouldn't say most, but actually, I mean, this also provokes a very strong reaction in me, because I just have this, and it also connects to what you were saying, Josie, about, I mean, there's something about the way that trauma perpetuates and surfaces, in that the appetite for this stuff is so heavily female. There's something about that feels really upsetting to me, in that it's a way of my theory, it's a way of sublimating and processing an awareness of cruelty and violence that comes out in this way that I find really difficult to deal with. And that's why, reading your work and other really great work on this has meant so much to me, because there's nothing more frustrating than something that's really important being presented in a way that undercuts what about it is really important, right?
Yeah, but it makes sense, right? Like, I mean, I have to say, I love true crime, and I should not. I'm against it in every single possible way, but I watch all of it, and I have read Ted Bundy's Wikipedia page a lot. And
I have too.
Yeah, but because I do understand the need to process violence and also misogyny, which is where a lot of this is sourced, right? And what parental trauma and all of this stuff in a system where it's okay, we're going to take care of you. We're the criminal justice system, and this guy's not going to get away, and we're going to make sure that this Ted Bundy guy dies, and then 30 years later we can make a documentary about him, and you have to know he's never going to escape. All of this is really tangible, and is something that, as a woman and as a parent, I understand. I would love for that to be true, but it's just not that simple. None of this is simple. None of these people are simple. None of these decisions are simple. Everything is so gray in this system, and that's kind of where I am right now, 10 years into kind of living this day in and day out, is there are no easy answers. There's no easy answers of the bad guy. There's no easy answers of the good guy. I mean, there might be in individual situations, but when you look at someone's life, it's just not that simple. And I think we've been done a disservice by being told that we can simplify things into two buckets when there are no buckets here.
Right.
There just aren't.
Pam, I wanted to ask you, so you've written 3 like huge wrongful conviction stories, right?
Very long, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, but also huge. There was Anthony Graves. And when did you write that?
Anthony Graves was 2010.
2010, and then there was The Innocent Man, which was
2012.
2012. And then the Joe Bryan one recently. And I'm wondering if you could talk about, because obviously stories surface that could be possible, 20,000 word wrong, how did you settle on any of or all of these stories, and how much pre-reporting do you do before, seizing on it?
So,
and also, how many of these have you dropped? You know what I mean? Like how often?
A bunch, yeah. After investing a lot of time sometimes,
Yeah.
but each of those came about in a different way. And there's actually one you didn't mention called Hannah and Andrew, about a woman who was wrongfully convicted of murdering a foster child in her care. And that story came to me because a newspaper reporter named John McCormick at the San Antonio Express-News drove to Austin with a car full of documents, and he was like, I've done everything I can with this. My editor's going to kill me if I write about this case anymore. Go.
Is that the most recent one?
This was about 5 years ago.
There's also the most recent one of a woman who was accused of.
Yes. That was, there were so many. Yeah. But so I wish that every story came to me that easily. That would be fantastic. But no, I mean, each one is different. And with the Joe Bryan story, actually the idea for that began with, I knew I wanted to write a forensic science story, and so I worked it backward. So I had been seeing these bloodstain pattern analysts testifying in various trials, and there was one I went to in 2016 in East Texas where there were 2 experts, one for the prosecution, one for the defense, and they looked at the same exact evidence and used the same exact methodology, and they came to 2 diametrically opposite conclusions. One was that the victim had been murdered, the other was that this person had committed suicide. And that was a big light bulb moment for me, that something was wrong with the science if they could come up with such different takes on that. So I ended up looking for a case that I thought illustrated these kind of problems. And then, I mean, a lot of what I do, so I'm trying to write public interest stories that I try to get everybody to read. So like hidden inside, it's like the vegetables that your mom hid in the whatever, spaghetti sauce, whatever. I'm trying to get you to maybe read something that you wouldn't ordinarily be drawn to, but because it's wrapped in a narrative that hopefully is compelling, that you will read it. And so that's what I'm always looking for. And I'm also always looking for, and this is true of any story, but wrongful convictions really, this is always true for them, for ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. That's something that just always, I think, narratively is very compelling.
All right, I think it's time for questions. Anyone got one?
I was wondering if you could speak to how you feel when you get fooled. When someone comes to you with a story that turns out not to be true, or something breaks in the media, in our news cycle, everything comes out immediately. At this point, we have the gray areas around the Jesse Smollett case. Like, how does it feel when you're on the other side and you feel misled? Or when do you decide that you have enough to go with?
Well, this may sound strange, but I always assume I'm being misled in interviews, especially about a really controversial case. So I don't mean that I don't trust the people who are talking to me. That I have to clarify what I mean. But I'm constantly evaluating, what is this person's agenda? What is this person's reason for deciding to meet with me? What is this person's reason for telling me this particular version of this narrative? And I'm sure that I have been burned terribly. I can't think of an instance in which I invested enormous amounts of time and then felt like somebody had out and out lied. I'm really interested in those inconsistencies, and I think I try to put those in the stories because they're so revealing in and of themselves, if that makes sense.
Hi, I'm a student journalist, and I'm trying to do more criminal justice work, but I find it really daunting. Oh, sorry. I'm a student journalist. I'm trying to do more criminal justice work, but I find it really daunting. So I'm just wondering, like, without an editor or a publication telling you where to go, like, where do you figure out where to start?
I think Pam will probably have better advice than me, so I'll start. She can end on a higher note. But I think that, so a lot of what I do is tracking local news, just like local news snippets, and you often hear something. So a case is going up for appeal because of accused prosecutorial misconduct, or this story that like the defense is saying they have evidence for is quite different than the prosecution, and often that just gives me a hint that something might be off. I do think a lot of this is trial and error. A lot of it's like who will respond to your FOIA, and who will respond to your FOIA appeal, and who will then respond to that appeal. Like you're playing a lot of like you're rolling the dice a lot. But I will say that it is daunting, but the individual stories can highlight something. That's what's kind of amazing about doing this work, is that you can tell a small story that tells 10,000 other stories. And there's a lot of return on investment, I think, about telling local criminal justice stories. I mean, it really can shift. I mean, look at the Laquan McDonald story. I mean, that was a FOIA that someone kept filing, and they finally got the video, and that shifted the entire criminal justice system in the second biggest county in America like that, like overnight. I mean, there is, given how hard it is to shift elections in this country sometimes, these are actually the easier ones to really make an impact, I think.
I just want to add to that. You can get a lot more in court records than you might think as a young, I would say that for things that when you were looking in retrospect, especially for things you're noticing inconsistencies, cases that have been dead for a little bit, things pop up in Pacer at different times. Documents are a good, I think, place to start, because you don't need muscle to be a good sleuther in the filing system.
I looked up a case on Pacer this week, and in the parentheses where it's supposed to tell you what case this is based on, it said, "Meh, find a good case," because this is. Yeah, did you see that? Yeah. So, you might find something great like that, where it turns out that nobody knows what they're talking about, and they made it very clear to you that easily.
I was just going to add, Pacer is expensive, and
but maybe not for much longer.
Yes, hopefully not for much longer. But I love a website called courtlistener.com. I am not paid by courtlistener.com, but it's amazing. It has a lot of the material that's on Pacer for free. And
I didn't know about
between that, Courthouse News, which is a great source for just like fascinating minutia that's going on. And I'm a big fan of, I have hundreds of Google alerts going on all sorts of bizarre keywords that I've strung together in hopes of finding a fantastic story one day. It hasn't panned out yet, but it will. But I think there's so many places to look in court records, as Jia said. And I think just drilling down, if there's one particular, the criminal justice system is so vast, right? So maybe pick two issues that you're really invested in and drill down in that. And if you find a compelling story, and if you're looking through documents, you likely will, there will be a way to tell that story. Mm-hmm. And the appeal is a great outlet for that.
All right, back here, standing up.
Hi. So the criminal justice system involves a lot of people of color, but journalism does not.
Yes.
And the industry has had a lot of problems. Sorry. So my question is about how the criminal justice system involves a lot of people of color, but the journalism industry has not, and has done really a bad job, especially in investigative teams, involving people of color, especially women of color, reporting on the criminal justice system. And I want to know, in your experience, especially having worked as a public defender and having done stories about, very articulately about a black man who has suffered an injustice, how you see, what are some of the bad examples or things that you wish you could fix about either the fixation over true crime or this explosion in a lot of investigative reporting about the criminal justice system, especially for students or people thinking about doing this kind of work, and so that they're not continuing these mistakes?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. So first, let me just say I was not actually a public defender. I just worked there. I don't want to have you guys think I'm something I'm not. I did not get that far. But this was before law school, and I think it's kind of the same in who your lawyer is, right? Like there's a system that supports the people in the system, and most of the people in the system do not look like the people supporting them. So this is this is journalism, this is like representation, this is just kind of a pattern. I think, I think there's a small contingent of us that like cover this that are Black, and even smaller that are Black women, I think, or women of color. I think where I find it mattering a lot is who wants to talk to you. And so it can be really difficult if you go to a small town, and I mean, I went to Gary, Indiana a couple of years ago for a story, and like the difference in me and the guy I was reporting with who would talk to them was like pretty vast. And I think that matters, that people feel like they have the ear of someone who can hear them. I also think not just what the field looks like, but who's represented in it, right? Like, are there people who are writing? I mean, there are a few, we were talking about this, about people who are formerly incarcerated, who can speak to what it's like to be in this system, who have lived through poverty, who like have, experienced some of this trauma. We're telling other people's stories, and very often we're not those people. And that is kind of like that. I mean, that's all through journalism, but I do think in this certain field, it plays a very stark role in that way.
I think about this, even though I don't cover criminal justice, obviously, but I think about it in terms of what you were saying earlier too, Pam. It's so important as a journalist to be able to be both skeptical and open at all times to whatever the person is saying to you, and it requires a lot of interpersonal sensitivity and insight. And there are certain, when people talk about diversity being an editorial, it is a need, because you want people who are equipped in as many ways as possible to understand the codes of what someone is saying, and read the neighborhood, and all the contextual things that you can't figure out if someone's telling the truth or why they're saying what they're saying. I think about this a lot.
And I think it's especially true. You read a lot of stories of they wouldn't talk to the police, or they immediately got a lawyer, or they refused to answer questions. And it's, you read that and you think guilty, right? And then you step back a little and you're like, it makes a lot of sense for a lot of people to not talk to the police, to run, right? To lie. Like, this actually is like an instinctual reality that's logical. But it's hard to put yourself there if you're just kind of telling the small story and can't step back from it. But I think, this is a big problem, and it's a big problem even at my outlet. It's a big problem everywhere that we don't have the people who are suffering as the people when telling the stories.
And I think we see that also in what we focus on, like all of the missing white girls. There are other people who are missing who we should be writing about as well.
Right.
Just picking up on something Josie said, as far as even additional ways to think about diversity. So one of my favorite criminal justice reporters is a woman named Carrie Injure at the Houston Chronicle. So Carrie was once incarcerated herself, and she has a fascinating life story that she talked about on Fresh Air, if you're interested. But she went through absolute hell and came out on the other side, and ended up deciding what to do with her skills was to help other people behind bars. And so whenever I am crafting a public records request that I am sending to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, I call Carrie and I say, what are the things I should be asking for that I'm not thinking of? And she always thinks of things that no reporter I know besides her would think of, because she was there. Ask for the transportation logs, ask for these things I'd never heard of before. And so I hope as we move forward that we see more and more voices like that.
All right, we'll have one more question round, and maybe y'all can try to be faster so that we can get through all of these Even though, I mean, not to say you should be faster, but there's so many people that have questions. All right, so let's talk about the impact of this work. It's interesting. It's hard to, the question of like, what do you hope for when you write a story is so frustratingly broad, and I'm sure you both get asked this question constantly. But I feel like I should ask it, and I also wonder, and Pam specifically, if reporting these wrongful conviction stories, if what you hope for going into them is different from, let's say, a criminal justice story generally, or just another story. Like, do they have different textures to you, and like in what you're hoping for as you work?
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, for better or for worse, the first really deep dive wrongful conviction story I wrote, that story, along with some other things that his attorneys were doing, ended up helping someone be free who had been on Texas death row. And that was, the highest point of my career. I'm not sure there will ever be any other moment like getting the call from Anthony Graves from the car as he's pulling away from the county jail where he was released from. That said, that usually doesn't happen. And I feel like the criminal justice beat can be deeply depressing because the rate of change and reform is so slow. And with the Joe Bryan case, I think I hoped that I would write about bloodstain pattern analysis, and then this would cause, I don't know what. These classes would no longer exist, and there would be all these challenges in court cases, and none of that happened. So I think these things take a while. On the other hand, what I've seen over the course of my career, I started writing about all this in the 90s when words like super predator were being used and prisons were being built everywhere, is how quickly things can change when you do inform people. And I think what I saw during that time period, late 90s onward, were DNA exonerations. And once the DNA exonerations started, I mean, people had been writing about these issues for a long time, there was a shift in the way that people understood some of these issues that has since broadened out to people talking about mass incarceration and cash bail and other issues, which is pretty great.
All right. No, all right. Well, so one thing that I wanted to ask you guys is more about this last 10 years, right? This sea change, this slow, frustrating, uneven, but really real sea change. And I guess, I mean, this, I'm throwing it back to Pam again, but you've written, over this period, you've written innocent stories. I mean, have you felt your understanding changing, and have you felt your readers changing with you? Are you able to count on a higher degree of skepticism of, say, forensic analysis than you were before?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there's sort of a lot of things that you can assume your audience is on board with that they weren't 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah. And that's a really wonderful place to start. And so I think building on that, that feels really encouraging. It really is amazing how fast the conversation has changed. And my mother now with her book group is talking about mass incarceration and all these things I never would have expected. And so I hope that's all leading to a good place, and we can see DAs who've been elected to office who are reformers, who are really, really, really trying to change things. And so I feel, generally hopeful about the direction we're headed in.
Yeah. So when I started covering DAs, which was in 2015, I was the only person who wrote about DAs nationally, at all. And I remember that I wrote a story about a guy who stole a stove from a construction site and drove off, and he was 60 miles away on the highway. He wasn't speeding or anything. The stove fell off his truck. 5 minutes later, someone came, they swerved, they hit someone else. Basically, someone died because of the robbery, but not really. Yeah. And when I wrote about this, I was like, this is insane. Like, they were convicted him of murder. He was going to go to prison for the rest of his life. And I was like, this is so crazy. And everybody who commented on my article, and don't read the comments obviously, but here I am, and they were like, he shouldn't have stolen this stove. Right. Like, he should be in prison forever because like he stole a stove and someone died because of it. Yeah. And I get the logical connection. Yeah. I do think we're splintering that a little bit in a way that is really important. I also think so much of this is fundamental to who we are, and until we really think about how we think about punishment and how we think about forgiveness and how we think about retribution, these are all really, really intrinsic parts of us that without kind of excavating them all the way, we're not going to get where we need to be. So we're seeing some changes, but at this rate, mass incarceration will be here for the next century. And so without really, really getting to our fundamental, who do we want to be? We're not there yet.
Yeah, and well, I was thinking, I mean, you've spoken about this on your podcast, but there's this idea that justice, means convictions, and that, that safety is an acceptable trade-off for freedom and, privacy and, what we're talking about even with the last 10 years, it's also a broader, I mean, the text here is the racial reckoning that that all of America's had to have with cell phones and videos of police brutality, right? Like it's like that was the door that got kicked wide open in terms of, maybe getting a reader or a listener to accept that, the prosecutorial narrative, right, is not the one. Yeah, and so do you guys think about, in terms of changing, we're sort of talking around changing your reader's understanding of the system in which we're all enmeshed in. Is that something that you, is that too big of a goal to think of consciously as you're working, or is it a perpetual one as you work?
I think it's a perpetual one that I often feel I'm failing at. But, I think there's such institutional inertia. And, I was just reading about the Florida judiciary where white men make up 25% of Florida's population, but 60% of their judges. And you just think about what that means and the decisions that those judges make and the biases that they come into that job with. And it's going to be incremental change. It's going to take a very, very long time. And I don't mean to be depressing, but it can get very depressing just to think about the vastness of the problems we're facing.
And I think, the judge point I think about all the time, because it's also judges who were once prosecutors and once were prosecutors in the same place where they are now judges. And, when nobody is questioning your instincts, it's really easy to stick to them. So, it took me a really long time. It wasn't until someone was like, maybe violent, people who are convicted of violent offenses aren't naturally violent and should also be considered into reform, that I was like, yeah. It's so much of this is just, you're not even questioning your instincts. And so a lot of this to me is trying to reframe this for people, because if you're only talking about the policy or the case, you're only scratching the surface, and you just keep running into the same problems. It's only, and again, I also feel like I'm failing all the time, but I am trying to make people rethink just the sheer way that they process information about the system at all. Whether or not the end result is good or bad, what kind of power do you want the system to have? And what, where are they making mistakes that you might not be seeing?
Well, let's talk about this question. So Pam, you were just saying, and we were talking earlier, let's talk about sort of the issue of hope versus the deadening awareness of how, because there's something about the more you learn that you don't know, and both of you guys are kind of brutally aware that the criminal justice system is full of things that people think are steps to justice, but are often just platforms that give way, right? It's every step at which something could go wrong, it has and it does and it will, right? And so with this there are a lot of people who understand this. There's so many people who have been part of the system that understand that. There's so many people that understand this, but it's, there is a deadening effect. Like we were also saying, if you are working, if you are a DA in Louisiana with 500, a defense attorney, a public defender in Louisiana with 1 million cases to get through in a week,
you have to turn it off a little.
You gotta trade off something. And I was wondering, and you with the podcast, it's intimate, right? Because you have to strike a tone that, conveys the extent of the problem without making people feel hopeless, which also involves not feeling hopeless yourself.
Right.
And I wonder, I mean, just how do you guys deal with the specific tone issue, this thing about when you're working with things that are incredibly depressing, and you have to convey that, but you also, that cannot be the end of what you convey. And I'm wondering how that feels, and it feels like an active negotiation or one that has become instinctive just because of your interest in who you are.
I think tone is something that is so important, and this is one of the many things I love about In the Dark, is the tone is just right.
Yeah.
It's not exploitative. It includes the voices of victims' families. It's meticulously researched. I mean, you know at all times you're in good hands as you're listening to that story. And I think where so many of these narratives can go wrong, she gets that right in that way. And I think I'm always learning. I mean, I said this to Josie, but every time I listen to the latest episode of her podcast, I'm shocked at my ignorance. I'm like, I've been writing about this for so long and I had no idea X, Y, and Z. And I felt that way listening to In the Dark, whether it was really thinking more deeply about jailhouse snitch testimony or jury selection or the myriad things she goes into. And so I love learning more. It's also a little daunting, and that's why I do sometimes think about going to law school. But Josie's telling me not to do it. So
I have a lot. We'll talk about that later, but don't go to law school. I was saying to Jia earlier that I feel this way reading stories about like the environment. Like every time I read about how climate change is like going to kill us all, I'm like, ah. And there are like journalists I know who cover this and can handle it, and I actually have to take it in small increments. And that's what I would like to try to do with the podcast, is make it so you can hear it but not leave feeling like there's no hope. I don't feel like there's no hope. I actually have a lot of hope, and part of this is because like I think that this system represents everything about who we are. And so like if I don't have faith in this getting better, I have faith in nothing getting better, and I just can't live like that. You know, I have a son, and he's just 15 months old, and I can get caught up thinking like, what if this happened to you? Like, what if you got put in the system and then, you know, and you never got out? And we were just talking about parents dying when like someone is wrongfully convicted, and just kind of the consistency. But there are some moments, there are a lot of moments of hope right now. There are not enough, but they do exist. Yeah. You know, they're there. You know, we see better DAs, we see better sheriffs, we see people talk about mass incarceration. We didn't see that even 10 years ago.
All right, let's do questions. All right, standing up back there.
I was wondering, you had mentioned plea deals earlier and what a large part they are in the system. I was also wondering how it affects structuring your stories.
Mm-hmm. When you don't have maybe that trial transcript, I know you said it was like 10% of the story, but you still have that structure to kind of go through what the prosecutor was doing, maybe ineffective assistance of counsel examples, and just how the plea system hides that, and if it does affect.
Yeah, I mean, I don't tell a lot of long-form stories that don't have trials because I can't. And I think that actually is like a huge loss, that there are a ton of people who are pleading to a ton of things day after day. I mean, that when we talk about exonerations, a couple of years ago, the National Registry of Exonerations for like 4 years or something, most of them are coming from Houston. Most of them are coming from drug cases in Houston because there were they had a policy, whatever, it's a whole long thing. But that is to say that like people were pleading guilty to drugs that they did not have. And the only reason they were exonerated is because they changed the policy. You can imagine that's happening everywhere all of the time, and we don't know because they're plea deals. But even letting people know that plea deals are really that big of a thing, because on SVU and all of those shows, they're not a thing. There's always a trial, right? 95 out of 100 times here in America, they're pleading. In some places, 99.9. I mean, in some places, defense attorneys have been practicing 10 years and we've never had a trial. That's like a real statistic. So making it clear to people, again, what they don't know, I think is part of the work.
Yeah, I think about that all the time. There's so much we don't know because of that. And the only thing I've been able to come up with is, let's say, writing about forensic science helps in some way, because when someone is considering whether or not to take a plea deal and they find out that the star expert witness in bloodstain pattern analysis, there are a couple of them, is going to testify for the state, their lawyer's going to tell them to plea out. So maybe we can sort of bite at it. Even though we don't have those stories, we can bite at some of the causes that make people take pleas.
All right, right there.
Hi. Pam mentioned like a new breed of progressive prosecutors or reformers, and I wondered actually where that intersected with journalism and if there's to be expected new standards for transparency at the plea deal level even.
I'm actually going to let Josie handle that one because she writes about this much more than me. I never write about progressive prosecutors, so I write about old school prosecutors.
Which there are many more old school prosecutors. But yeah, we've seen like in the past 4 years, we've seen a ton. We've seen a lot of progressive prosecutors, probably, again, just the surface of the 2,300 we see nationwide. There are some new standards for transparency. There are kind of new expectations of what these prosecutors will do. In Chicago, for example, the old prosecutor, Anita Alvarez, tons of cases went under her that people who were innocent, who she just kind of ignored them. The new prosecutor, Kim Fox, is like more dedicated to having a conviction integrity unit and reanalyzing those cases. There's also a lot she doesn't even know. Like their system, like her system does not keep track of misdemeanors at all. Like 400,000 misdemeanors, no prosecutor enters a single thing about them any single day of the week. So like there's some movement on this, and I do think it's really important. I still think we're facing like these kind of systemic obstacles that like even the best person in office can't really overcome themselves.
I think you do see the rise of conviction integrity units, which are huge in terms of looking back at cases where there may have been big problems. And I always think it's interesting to look at which big city DA's offices have them and which don't.
Right. And also, like, who actually has staff in them? You'll sometimes find DAs
sometimes they
that
have them and it's window dressing.
There's nobody who works there, which makes it hard to actually exonerate people if you don't have anybody on the job.
All right, another question. Here, right there.
Given how important your records are to getting information stories, I've been shocked just a little bit of reporting about, criminal justice that I've done. How many? The whole thing? Okay. This is sort of a wonky, technical reporting question.
We love wonky.
Okay. Obviously a lot of, for narrative long-form stories, you're going to get a lot out of a court record or a trial transcript, or you hope to. I've been kind of shocked by stories that I've looked into where the records are gone. They're like, after 30 years, we just trash them. It blows my mind. Is anyone out there trying to keep that from happening? Do you guys encounter this in your work where it just doesn't exist? What?
I wish I had a good answer to that. So my current story, I've filed 44 public records requests for, and they this deals mainly with very old cases, and the response I most often get is, that's outside our retention period. Those files were destroyed and I'm like, what? Like, especially in the digital era, why? Like, how hard is it to scan a document? But what I would say to that is when I have assumed that something couldn't be found, I've often been proven wrong. So I think you just don't know. It matters so much from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It matters who might be helping you in the clerk's office or wherever you might be. I just found a trial transcript from 1979 that was in the Texas State Archives that all the attorneys in the case had told me didn't exist anymore. So I guess we just have to keep looking. But as far as efforts to end the destruction of physical records, I don't know the answer to that. I wish there was something afoot, and I don't know of it if there is.
Yeah, I don't think it's afoot, is my guess. I mean, there's so many jurisdictions, there's so many records, there's such a process. What I will say is that, I think to Pam's point, in my experience, people rarely actually trash things. They put them in another building, in another basement, in another place. And so that's not always true. I'm sure that they actually do trash plenty. I think that people are generally like us. The idea of throwing something away like that of that importance is a little daunting. And so what that really means is like we don't know where it is and we don't want to go through it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't exist. But no, nobody's doing the work to make sure that all of these cases are being kept. So if you guys want to all join together, we could try to do it. But yeah, it's a lot of stuff that it's terrifying. Yeah.
All right, back there.
Hey. So I wanted to ask, what are your relationships with the subjects of your stories like? When you're reporting on all these injustices, how do you sort of balance, doing your job as a journalist, but also, being a human?
I wish I had a good answer to that. I often will spend a year or more digging into something. I mean, I'm doing other things as well, but there are people who I've spent more time with them than some of my friends in recent months. I certainly email and text and call with them more often than some of my close friends, and they are often either in crisis or dealing with a very difficult situation. And I don't always know the rules. I struggle with that on a daily basis, and I just try to be sort of a good human being in the sense of listening and sometimes periodically reminding someone, of what my role is, and that I'm a reporter and I'm there to gather information, and let's talk about what we just spoke about. Is that something that you're sharing with me for public consumption or not? I also go over almost everything before we even get to fact checking, especially sensitive material, because I just feel when people have entrusted such precious time and material to me, I want to be respectful of that. So I don't have that's not a good journalism school answer.
I have it a little different than Pam in that, like, usually the subjects of my stories are the prosecutors or the police, which means I'm not on great terms with most of them. It's not a great relationship most of the time. But I will say that it is a responsive relationship because these people are very rarely held accountable. And so, like, I'm actually always surprised at how often they will, like, pick up the phone and have a conversation with me because they don't know any better, because very rarely are people pushing them on stuff like this, just because of the way this is not because I'm doing something extraordinary. It's because of the way that, like, local journalism, like we were saying, is struggles, and these are opaque systems. And so I think Pam, like, her stories tell these, like, very compassionate, amazing stories about people who have actually been convicted of crimes. I spend less time talking to people who have been convicted and more time talking to people who convicted them, which changes the relationship, but also is a reminder that I have to be human and remember that they are also human, that it's not always useful to castigate them in the same way that they've castigated other people.
All right, one more question. Who's got one? I see a hand right there.
Hello. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, like, misdemeanors, or talking about, like, rightful convictions in, like, a wrongful system, kind of the boring things that aren't sensationalistic, and how do you get people to care about them?
Yeah, I'm interested in what you would say about this. There are tons of, like, most of the system is misdemeanors. Most people are kind of getting in the system, like being introduced to it through some small charge over some small thing that they're playing to because it's not worth going to trial, it's not worth sitting in jail. These cases add up, and they create kind of a class of people who have, like, one hand in the criminal justice system, which just presents an entire array of complications for how you live your life. And it increases the likelihood of so many things, of you getting kicked out of your housing, of you losing your kids, of you losing your job. Like, it just creates this kind of universe of possibility, none of which is good. Your question about rightful convictions, what I really am trying to tell here is that things are complicated. So there was recently a story about two kids who stole something from a corner store in Chicago. They both went running. The cops chased them both, shot one of them to death, and the other kid got convicted of murder because, like, technically law of parties, sort of felony murder. And to me, that's the perfect example of a rightful conviction that is wrong. That's what the law says. But the question is, like, should the law say that? And what is that? Who does that deter from stealing from a corner store? Nobody, right? Who does that hold accountable who's actually done something wrong? Nobody. So really asking these questions of what is it? What is punishment? Like, how do we see ourselves in people who have been convicted of crimes? And what is a crime? I mean, there was the story, I think I was talking to you about this, about incense, a woman burning incense in her house. The incense, like, something went wrong and her house caught on fire, her 2 kids died, and now she's going to prison for murder. And to me, that is technically under the law, she did it. That's a wrongful conviction. There are a lot of stories like this that I think deserve unearthing.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't necessarily have the answer to the question, but I think it is important to show how people enter the criminal justice system and then the sort of cascading effect that happens once you're in it. And maybe that's a way of telling some of those misdemeanor stories, is it's sort of like the gateway. It's so hard to turn back. There's so many mechanisms that fall into place once you're in. And so maybe that's one way of doing a story like that.
Well, I think our time's up. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for coming.